Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to the first Queen's College MCR Angevin Talk of the 2021 Michaelmas term. I am truly delighted that we have the privilege of hosting Professor Adam Grant. Professor Grant is a New York Times bestselling author of multiple books that have sold millions of copies and have been translated into 35 languages. He has been Wharton's School of Business top-rated professor in organizational psychology for 7 straight years and has been recognized as one of the world's 10 most influential management thinkers and Fortune's 40 Under 40. His podcast, Work Life, tops the charts, and his TED Talks on original thinkers and givers and takers have been viewed more than 50 million times. He's also a former junior Olympic diver. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks, Anna. It's great to be here at Cambridge.
For those around the world that have joined us, we all know best-selling author is a term that is easily bandied around. Think Again has reached the second most widely sold and read book in print ever. This is a real testament to who you are, Adam, and we are really delighted to have you with us. In Cambridge, we are in a world of best-in-class, outstanding academics, many of whom you have written or will write their own books. So what is your process for thinking about and researching books that have a widely disproportionate impact in the world?
Well, let me first say there have been many, many books that have had more impact and reached far more people than anything I've written. So you should take everything I say with many grains of salt. I don't think my process is very systematic or structured. And that's a little bit an accident. It's a bit deliberate, though, because I know that I tend to be a very linear thinker. And sometimes that constrains my creativity. So when it comes to choosing topics, I like to be a little bit less disciplined, knowing that'll show up when I start to organize my thoughts. What I used to do was I would basically take on any topic that I was personally passionate about. And that turned out to be a necessary but not sufficient condition, because it turned out there are lots of things I find interesting that no one cares about. Or that small niche communities that people are interested in, right? I could write a book about springboard diving and have a ton of fun doing it. And I don't think it would reach as many people as the books I've written have managed to do. So I obviously want to think about, what is important to a broad audience of people around my areas of expertise, which are work in psychology. And for the first couple of books I wrote, that was enough, right? I said, okay, if it's interesting to me and important to others, I'm good. What I don't think I spent enough time on was, do I have something novel to say about this topic? And, I found myself spinning my wheels on trying to write drafts of chapters saying, well, I kind of ran out of ideas. Like, I care about this and I think it matters, but I didn't feel like I had something to contribute. And so now when I draw the Venn diagram, I want to answer that third question, which is, do I have data? Do I have expertise to bring to the table that's not already in the conversation? And I think the interplay of those 3 things is really valuable for me. The other thing I've found pretty helpful over time is to do the pattern recognition exercise of actually looking at I even do this with my social media posts every month or so, just looking at the themes that I'm happening to share on, because there's often a set of common topics that I don't even realize. So one of the reasons that I decided to write Think Again was I had found that a lot of my posts were about the need to question our assumptions, the struggles we have to listen to the ideas that make us think hard instead of just the opinions that make us feel good, the difficulties we have listening to people who challenge our thought process, and how much we gravitate toward people who just validate our existing conclusions. And it was only after realizing that I'd been kind of mini ranting about this on Twitter for a couple months that I realized, oh, there's a book there.
And we'll circle back to Think Again, because I know there's a lot of lessons for all of us there. I've also heard you discuss interestingness from the sociologist Murray Davis, who says ideas survive not because they are true, but because they are interesting. Can you just embellish on that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know if Davis was right, but it is a really interesting claim. And in that sense, it sort of proves his point, even if it's wrong. So Davis, he was a sociologist who wrote a classic paper that I really imprinted on in grad school, where he said what makes an idea interesting is that it challenges conventional wisdom, that it overturns a set of assumptions people held. And it just immediately clicked for me, because part of the reason that I became an organizational psychologist was, as an undergrad in Cambridge the Younger, I took a bunch of classes where I kept learning about experiments and longitudinal studies that dramatically shifted my thinking. I remember almost on a daily basis coming out of class and sending, hey, have you seen this study, to my family, to my friends, to the point where they started telling me, like, you don't have to share everything you learn. And that was just exhilarating for me. It was a rush of discovery. But Davis had an important qualifier. He said, people only are interested in ideas that challenge their weakly held beliefs, where they say, oh, that's interesting. If you question one of their strongly held beliefs, a core opinion or an identity that they hold dear, they are going to shut down instead of opening up. And I think that's where a lot of this falls apart, is we have a lot of people who have made their ideas their identity. And that means they're not excited when something questions their preconceptions. They don't see that as an interesting opportunity for growth. They see it as a threat to their egos and to their social status. And I think that's a huge problem.
Yeah, and we all become entrenched in how we think and our self-worth and everything else. And I'm hoping that we can talk to that a little bit later in our chat. Could you give us an orientation on your journey in becoming a tenured professor in organizational psychology? And you did touch on why you wrote Think Again, but could you embellish that a little bit?
Sure. So when I was an undergrad, I was torn between psychology and physics. I really wanted to understand the world, and I thought, the social world and the physical world were both endlessly fascinating. I quickly discovered that there were a lot more gaps in our understanding of human behavior than there were in at least my ability to change our knowledge of the cosmos, right? As much as I want to understand physics, I didn't feel like I had a lot to contribute there. Whereas with psychology, I'd come out of my classes with new ideas and new questions that I couldn't wait to explore. I had no idea what I wanted to do with that. No clue whatsoever. I knew I didn't want to be a therapist. I don't have the patience. I wanted also to try to have some impact at scale, as opposed to working with people one-on-one. I knew that there wasn't a lot else out there, and I was kind of stuck. And then my junior year, I took two classes that really shifted my plans. One was an organizational psychology class with Richard Hackman, who had become the world's leading expert on teams, but had no idea what job he wanted, and decided that he was going to live vicariously through all the jobs he thought were potentially interesting, and then study how to make teams great in those worlds. So his hook, or at least the hook for me in the way that he approached his job, was he wanted to be a professional basketball player. He studied basketball coaches. He was interested in being an airline pilot. He studied cockpit crews and how they could fly more safely. He loved music, and so he went and studied symphony orchestras. And then toward the end of his career, he was interested in national security work, and he studied the intelligence agencies in the US and how they could become more than the sum of their parts. And he was a generalist when it came to all the different career paths and fields, but he was a specialist in how to make people collaborate. And I say make very deliberately, because he could not stand working with other humans. So it was a puzzle to him that anyone could ever collaborate well. And I thought that was just riveting. I thought, okay, maybe the solution to my career indecision is I'm going to try to study other people's jobs, and that will be my job, and I can try to make work not suck. And then I took a personality psychology class with Brian Little. He's the most riveting teacher and the most caring mentor you could possibly imagine. And Brian just shattered my beliefs on a daily basis. I remember one lecture where he introduced us to a quick assessment on whether we were introverts or extroverts. I found out that I was an introvert. And then I watched this charismatic, captivating speaker say that not only was he an introvert, he was so introverted that he would be hiding in the bathroom after the lecture. And so we shouldn't try to find him because he needed to recharge. And then he proceeded to explain that introversion, extroversion is not where you get your energy. That's a myth. It's how easily overstimulated you are and how sensitive you are to stimulation. And so one of the big differences physiologically between introverts and extroverts is that introverts are much more likely to get overloaded by bright lights, by loud sounds, by very intense social interaction. And that was powerful for me because it never even occurred to me that as an introvert, I could get on stage. And when I saw my introverted professor dazzle an audience, I said, wait a minute, maybe I could take these psychology ideas that I love and learn how to share them and communicate my passion for them in a way that, that is not socially awkward or uncomfortable or just plain exhausting. And that kind of lit a fire under me. And I decided that I wanted to have a job where I got to study the big questions of human character and well-being and success. And that I wanted to try to pay forward some of the great teaching that I had benefited from.
So you have explained to us that rethinking in the book is both a skill set and a mindset. Can you expand on that? Is changing your mind a valuable skill set? People often think it is a weakness.
Yeah, I think it's a vital skill set. I think it's a critical both mindset and skill set in a rapidly changing world. If the world stood still, you could just form your opinion once and then your mental work would be done. But in a turbulent world, a lot of the opinions you formed yesterday were formed in a world that doesn't quite exist anymore. And that means that some of your knowledge has an expiration date. It means some of your best practices are no longer effective. And it also means that even some of the beliefs and assumptions that you hold dear might be incomplete or incorrect. And so I don't think that we can really get away with saying, well, the way that I evolve is I learn. I think we need to say, in order to keep up as the world evolves, I need to unlearn. And that means I need to be quick to think again, right? Not just form an opinion and then stick to it.
Right, and it's quite painful to unlearn things, especially the older we get and the more entrenched we are in who we are and how we see the world. And that's a very valuable lesson for all of us. You talk about the concept of thinking like a scientist in the book. And from your research, you conclude that we all talk like either preachers, prosecutors, or politicians. So can you embellish this a little bit for us? And what do you mean that why is it better to think like a scientist? What does that look like?
Try. Originally, this is Phil Tetlock's research. He observed that a lot of us get locked into the modes of preaching, prosecuting, and politicking when we think, when we make decisions, when we talk to other people. So in preacher mode, you're proselytizing your views. In prosecutor mode, you're attacking someone else's views. And in politician mode, you only listen to people if they already agree with your views. And I think the danger of all three of those mindsets is they stop you from being open because you've already decided they're right, they're wrong, and you're right. So other people need to think again, but you don't. Thinking like a scientist, I think, is a great alternative because when I say think like a scientist, I don't mean that you need to own a microscope or buy a telescope. I just mean that you don't let your ideas become your identity, right? That you are as motivated to look for reasons why you might be wrong as you are to find reasons why you must be right. And there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that if we teach people to think like scientists, you can do this with students, you can do this with entrepreneurs, you can do it across fields. They actually make better decisions because instead of clinging to their convictions, they realize that a lot of their beliefs are just hunches. They're hypotheses waiting to be tested. And then they can think about their daily choices as little experiments that sometimes prove their hypotheses false. And that makes it easier for them to pivot and adapt and reevaluate. And I think that's something that we should probably all be a little bit more comfortable doing.
Absolutely. And that's how we really grow. And, it's very easy. I was thinking about this reading your book and I was like, so when did I have my biggest growth spurt recently? Like you really have to think about, what is meaningful, what has changed, what have I learned? Why am I doing things this way versus the other way? It's very humbling to allow yourself to do that exercise, really. So we all have this inner dictator, you say, this totalitarian ego where we become entrenched. So how do we exercise humility in avoiding this? What is a tool where we can catch ourselves?
My favorite one personally is to have a challenge network. My challenge network is the group of people that I trust to hold up a mirror so I can see my own blind spots more clearly. They're the people who tell the unpleasant truths instead of the comforting lies. And one of the things I've done just this year, actually, is I've reached out to a bunch of people that I trust to play that role. And I've said, hey, you might not know this, but I consider you a founding member of my challenge network. And then I had to explain to them what a challenge network was. Like, look, I'm not thinking support network here where you cheerlead for me and you always have my back. I'm thinking you're the person who I rely on to poke holes in my ideas, to pressure test my thinking. And I know I haven't always taken your criticism well. Sometimes I've been way too defensive. Other times I've just been dismissive. And I regret that because I know I need you to push me to think again. So if you ever hesitate because you're afraid you're going to hurt my feelings or you're going to hurt our relationship, don't. The only way you can hurt me is by not telling me the truth. I've gotten much better feedback, Anna, since I had those conversations. And frankly, I think this is the purpose in many ways of higher education, right? My favorite thing about being in college was being surrounded by people who were fearless about telling me when they thought I was wrong and then bringing me the sharpest logic and the strongest evidence to try to get me to question those beliefs. I learned a lot from those conversations, but I also enjoyed them. And it really made me rethink what intellectual chemistry meant. I think that the chemistry is not about always agreeing with someone, right? Musical harmony doesn't exist when everyone plays the same note. It's about enjoying your disagreements with someone and finding, maybe different beats and saying, hey, creative tension, that makes beautiful music. And I think we all need to give the people in our lives who are in a position to see things we can't or won't the permission to play that role for us.
Well, and in the book, when you talk about this, you describe that the best person who in your challenge network, the profile is what you call a disagreeable giver. So that segues into the giver and taker argument. But what do you mean by a disagreeable giver?
I mean that we need to separate two personality traits that we often confuse. So agreeableness, disagreeableness is one of the major dimensions of personality around the world. We know agreeable people as warm, friendly, polite, welcoming, Canadian.
Me.
Disagreeable people, more critical, skeptical, also statistically overrepresented among engineers as well as barristers. And I assumed for a long time that spectrum went hand in hand with the spectrum of of generosity to selfishness. And I assumed that people who are agreeable were going to be givers. People who are disagreeable were going to be takers. And I gathered data from over 30,000 people across industries and countries. I found a zero correlation between those axes. And eventually what dawned on me was agreeableness, disagreeableness is about social harmony, right? You're trying to please people and get along with them versus, you're comfortable pushing back. You don't mind some competitiveness or some contentiousness or even some conflicts. Giving and taking are inner motives. They're more based on your values than just your traits. They're about your intentions toward others, whether you're trying to help or whether you're trying to only advance your own interests. And actually, there's a paper by Diebels, Leary, and colleagues that came out a couple of years ago suggesting that individual differences in selfishness are a sixth dimension of personality to complement the big five, separate from agreeableness, which I think only adds to the case that I was building with my own data. And what I love about disagreeable givers is they're the people who dish out tough love, right? They're gruff and tough on the surface, but they're doing it because they care. They want to help. They give you the critical feedback that you may not want to hear, but you really need to hear. And I think they're the best members of your challenge network because of that combination of they're fearless when it comes to what they say, but they're also kind in why they say it and hopefully how they say it.
And they also have your back and your best interest at heart, which is what we all need. So can you give us an example where your challenge network successfully changed your mind?
Oh yeah, there are a lot of examples.
Yeah.
One that happened relatively recently was I was getting ready to give a TED talk over the summer on languishing and how to escape languishing and find flow. And I did what now has become a standard routine for me, although I'm open to rethinking it, but so far it's working pretty well. I wrote a draft of the talk. I tinkered with it. I revised it a bunch of times. And then I sent it to about 8 people independently. And I didn't tell them who else was receiving it. That way I got their independent judgment. And, if only one person raised an issue, I think maybe that's taste, it's idiosyncratic. If 5 different people have the same beef with it, now I see that's actually quality, right? That's a shared opinion. And one of the pieces of pushback that I got was that I was failing to be personal enough in the talk, that I was basically just telling the lessons from the research, and I wasn't putting enough of myself into it. And my argument was, this is not about me. I'm trying to talk about how many people have been languishing, especially during the pandemic, and how there's this neglected middle child of mental health where you feel kind of blah or meh, but you're not totally burned out or depressed. And they said, yeah, but if you just talk about those emotions, it's going to feel very clinical. We're not going to relate to you, and we're not going to feel it. And everyone's languished during this pandemic at some point. And don't you have a responsibility to tell people that and talk about your own experiences of languishing? And I realized they were right. And then Marissa Chandel gave me this brilliant suggestion. She said, I don't know why you're not talking about this in the talk, but you told me that what pulled you out of languishing last year was in part playing Mario Kart with your kids and your extended family online. Why don't you talk about that? And that actually became the core story to anchor the talk. It was a great rethinking moment for me. I'm really glad I didn't give the original version of the talk.
Do you ever choose not to be persuaded by your group, your group?
Of course. I think in some cases, I realize they have different goals from mine. And I say, okay, I think your criticism is right if you have the following objectives, but that actually is not what I'm trying to accomplish. So thank you. I think in other cases, I have had to push back because I think I have better evidence or more relevant experience. So actually in that same talk, I was gearing up to do a little demonstration of what happens when you ask people to count too many blessings in their life. And in the rehearsal, it didn't go that well. And somebody I really trust in my challenge network said, you might want to drop that. What the data that person didn't have was I had done versions of this demonstration over 100 times on stage and in classrooms. And so I had this huge amount of data that in my experience, over 95% of the time, the result was really interesting and helped make the point that I was trying to illustrate. And to me, it was worth taking the risk when it was by and large successful. That person only had one data point. It was not successful in the n=1. And so it seemed like a bad idea. And so what I want to know is, how valid is the evidence that the person's bringing to the table? And if we don't have the data yet, we should run the experiment a bunch of times. Let's think like scientists, and we'll find out who's more likely to be right.
Yeah. So what is your opinion on the following thing? So that we have a finite amount of time. So what do? Do we double down on our strengths that we have as people and get better in those areas? Or do we work to improve our weaknesses? How do you see that in terms of what do you work on? Where do you concentrate?
I think it's a false dichotomy, Anna. I think that many of our strengths are actually our weaknesses. So one of my favorite definitions of a weakness is a strength overused or misused. There's some research by Rob Kaiser and colleagues, which actually shows that overdoing your strengths is a career derailer if you're a leader. And so think about, for example, a leader who's very charismatic and then fails to listen to anybody in the room, leaves people feeling excluded, misses out on learning opportunities. Think about, I can think of a bunch of leaders who also are extremely charismatic, who underprepare because they're used to being able to wing it and getting away with it until they can't. Right. So I think you have to understand that a strength is not just being good at something, it's also knowing when and how much to use of it and where it's appropriate. And that means you've got to work on both, right? You've got to say, if one of my strengths is assertiveness, I have to work on inquiry. And that is what will allow, right, those two things to excel in balance. Excuse me. If one of your strengths is being a giver, if you're an extremely generous person, you have to watch out for being too selfless, and learn how to set boundaries and be thoughtful about who you help and when you help and how you help, so that you do it in a way that's energizing, and adds value as opposed to exhausting and distracting. And I don't think we can just do one or the other. In terms of, I guess, relative prioritization, there's some research I love by Ayelet Fishbach and her colleagues, which shows that novices respond better to strength-based feedback because they're not sure if they can do it, and you want to build up their confidence. Whereas once you move toward mastery or expertise, you don't really need to work on your strengths as much as you need to deal with whatever your Achilles heels are, and you can handle the criticism a little bit better.
Well, you wrote a book on power moves a few years ago, and where you make the case that power has changed. So what made you so interested in power, the concept, and how is that dynamically changing now?
What originally sparked my curiosity was being in rooms with powerful people that I never expected to have access to, and being intensely curious about whether it had changed them, and how they were trying to change it. So I remember going to the World Economic Forum in Davos and watching people like literally not make eye contact unless they had read someone's badge first and decided they're important. This is insane. Let's just pause and think about this for a second. There are only a few thousand people invited to this. So if you got in that room, somebody decided that you were worth talking to, or that you had accomplished or led something meaningful. And yet people were still trying to figure out the hierarchy and decide, well, is this, CEO worth my time or not? And it just seemed ridiculous. And whenever I'm mildly disturbed or disgusted by something, as a psychologist, I realize there's something to learn there, and that's potentially an opportunity for research. So I went back to Davos the next year and decided I was going to do an audiobook project where I'd pick a bunch of powerful people and also a bunch of social scientists who are experts on power, and try to get to the bottom of how power was changing. And I love the Moises Naim argument. I think he captured this beautifully in The End of Power. His prior book, he's got a new one coming out actually that's also excellent, on the revenge of power, which I highly recommend. But he essentially argued that power is easier to acquire in this networked world we live in, but it's harder to keep and harder to wield well, because the very things that make it accessible to more and more people also make it harder to maintain and wield effectively. And I think that captured something that I really hadn't seen clearly before, which is that, all of a sudden we entered this world in Web 2.0 where, people who had not been, born into resources, people who had not been lucky enough to win the academic lottery and get into a Cambridge, were still able to get their startups funded. Were able to teach themselves to code. Were able to land in a position of influence by virtue of their own initiative and ability to find mentors who they otherwise wouldn't have met. And I think that's a really interesting shift, that power has become in some ways less traditionally hierarchical and more networked.
Right. And so you feel that's that's what people in power are struggling with now, how to keep it contained, how to remain relevant in a very much faster, less hierarchical world.
I think so. And one of the things I keep seeing with leaders is the higher they climb, the more compromised their judgment gets in certain ways. So I think about this a lot in the context of givers and takers, because I see a lot of powerful people trusting, in hiring somebody who turns out to have a history and reputation of selfish behavior, and they didn't catch it. Like, what is going on here? Well, one of the things that's going on is that takers are great fakers when they're dealing with powerful people, because they know that's how you get ahead. And then they realize, gosh, it's a lot of work to pretend to care about everyone. And they let their guard down with peers and subordinates who get to see more of their true colors. What that means concretely is, in many cases, the least credible judge of character is the person in the room with the most power, because the taker is the most motivated to flatter that person and impress them. And that means that I think we need to delegate some of our judgment, that when it comes to knowing who can you trust, it's actually the least powerful people in the room that get the most accurate information. And I think that's something that leaders are going to have to learn quickly. Otherwise, they will be at their own peril.
And it's the people that have the boots on the ground that really understand the dynamic on the everyday behavior of people. And that's where you really can get your intelligence versus sort of some assessment at the top. So I've heard you say conformity is a dangerous thing. What do you mean by this? You also use the example of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund, founded by Ray Dalio in 1975. Within the culture that they operate in are very clear principles that if you see something you disagree with, you are expected to speak up front. It's what you call radical transparency and idea meritocracy. Can we talk a little bit about that? And do you agree with that? And is it sustainable?
Wow, this is a complex set of questions. Let me start by saying that in psychology, conformity is normally defined as going along with someone else's opinion, not because you agree with it, but because you're essentially seeking social approval. So a lot of conformity is driven by thinking like a politician, where you're trying to cater to your constituents. And I think that the reason I believe that's dangerous is because it leads to groupthink. Sometimes it gets called the hippo effect, right? Where the hippo, it's my favorite acronym, Anna. It stands for highest paid person's opinion. As soon as that is known, people want to jump on the bandwagon. Instead of diversity of thought, you fall into groupthink. And I worry also that those problems are magnified for people who lack power or status, right? If you are the only woman of color in a team dominated by white men, if you're the most junior person in the room, even if you're the introvert in the group of extroverts, it is that much harder to overcome the hippo effect. So I went to Bridgewater about 6 years ago because I had students who had worked there and also studied the culture. And they kept telling me it was the most interesting example they'd ever seen of a cultural commitment to fight groupthink and to find out what people actually thought and challenge each other's thinking as opposed to just letting everyone conform to the hippo. And I came away thinking that they have some practices I would love to see more organizations follow. And full disclosure, I was impressed enough that a couple of years later, Ray Dalio asked me to create a principles assessment with him so that we can help people gain self-awareness and other awareness. And along with Brian Little, who, by the way, is on the Cambridge faculty, we've created that assessment and rolled it out earlier this year. I think the biggest thing that I learned from Bridgewater was it's basically a whole company that's designed to be a challenge network. And one of the things I was struck by was when you go through onboarding, they had an iPad that essentially took you through a bunch of cases so that you could see the culture in action. You'd watch videos, you'd read email threads, and they tried to highlight their core principles in action. But unlike almost any company I'd ever studied, they asked you at the end of each case, do you agree? So you were invited to challenge the culture on day one as a newcomer. And I think that, if you made a compelling argument that one of the principles was incomplete or two of them were inconsistent, they would think about revising their principles based on your feedback. Then you got into performance reviews. And one of the dimensions you were evaluated on is whether you challenge the people above you. So you could get fired there for not criticizing your boss's boss, which is something I would be thrilled to see happen in more organizations. And this is not to say that Bridgewater is perfect. Like every organization, they have warts, they have growing pains, they have real challenges. But I think the fundamental principles of trying to create an environment where people do challenge because they care, where no one has the right to hold a critical opinion without speaking up about it are really valuable. And I think they're a great way to fight conformity. Now, personally, I would add that I want you to be as candid as possible in what you say, but also as thoughtful as possible in how you say it.
Well, and in the book, you give the example of the whiteboards and markers debate, that they spend hours and hours having that discussion. And, you think, well, why would all these very highly paid, very intelligent people do this? But how do you explain that just on a conclusive level?
At first, I was appalled. I watched this whole video of these wildly successful people arguing about the height of a whiteboard on a wall, and then doing this whole diagnostic process to figure out why it was hung at the wrong height. And personally, I would still choose not to spend any time on that. right? Let's be clear. But I think the underlying principle that I took away from Ray there is that situations repeat, right? And lots of the conflicts we run into, many of the decisions we make are the same patterns repeating over and over again. And what had happened in that particular case was that Ray asked for the whiteboard to be adjusted because he thought it was at the wrong height. It didn't get adjusted. And then he said, okay, this is a microcosm of one of our cultural problems here, which is we need to work on people following through on commitments. We need to make sure that, that people are delivering when a request is made. And he said, as a founder, if I make a request like that and it doesn't get done, it signals to me that there is a breakdown in one or more of our practices or our collaboration habits. And so then the diagnosis is an attempt to figure out, is this a systemic failure? And can we create now a process to try to prevent that from happening in much more consequential, high stakes situations? And I thought the premise there is pretty good to say that so much of organizational life, and this is true in marriage as well, right? It's true in friendships. A lot of our arguments are the same fundamental battles being fought over and over again, but we're so caught in the weeds that we don't actually see the underlying patterns that are common. And if we can step out of the analysis of one to say, what is the pattern here? Then we can try to prevent or better manage all of the arguments that fit in that category.
Adam, thank you very much for all your input. I'm going to open this up to Q&A now. Marina Lirinzi, who is with us, will host the Q&A. Marina is in her second year of her PhD in personalized medicine, and is also president of the Venture Capital and Private Equity Society of Cambridge. So Marina, thank you, over to you and welcome. And I'll be back towards the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you so much, Professor Grant, for this incredibly interesting fireside chat. Unsurprisingly, we have an enormous number of questions from both YouTube and from Zoom. I'd like to start with the first question. To what extent does identity foreclosure, particularly in young adults, inhibit creativity and entrepreneurial pathways?
Marina, first of all, you are definitely not an underachiever. I'm glad that you haven't foreclosed on a single identity here. I see it a lot with my students. It's so common that students arrive at Wharton saying, I've known since I was 4 years old that I want to work on Wall Street, or in some cases, I want to be a lawyer or a doctor. And what they fail to realize is they formed those plans long before they actually knew what their interests and strengths and values were. And also before they had any clue what it actually meant to do those jobs day to day. And I think in many cases, they got seduced by status. They were drawn to the most prestigious profession, forgetting that even if a job impresses other people, is probably not the right choice if it depresses you on a daily basis. And what I want to do is encourage, whether it's aspiring founders or, students pursuing any path, to not foreclose on a single identity, to recognize that you don't have to be one thing. You can do many things. And the best way to explore a meaningful career is to think like a scientist. Herminia Ibarra at another school in the UK would quickly tell us that we should think like scientists in the sense that we should test and learn. Right, that we need to run little career experiments that allow us to try on different identities and see whether they're a fit or not. And I think if we stay open to doing that, we're much less likely to have identity crises, right? Because when you foreclose on one and say, okay, I'm going all in on this one path, you close your mind to others.
Absolutely, yes. So our next question is actually from the Bout Room. They will actually unmute themselves. Straight from Queen.
You know when it's on. Oh, sorry.
You're on.
Am I on? Hi. I've been interested, Adam, in kind of the stuff you've worked on in writing and talking about burnout, and especially the question about how to make work suck less, basically. That's a big one. Like not just, colleges like Queen's, but kind of university-wide and academia and all these things. Where do we even start with that? Like if we're like something as complicated and decentralized as a university with all kinds of institutional practices and things, what do we do to affect change at that kind of level? Where would you start with that? Or do you want to help us with that? Because that'd be awesome.
I'm not sure if I can help, but I love the question. And I think it's an important one for all of us to be asking in a time where a lot of people are facing a lot of stress. We did a work life episode in season 3 called Burnout is Everyone's Problem, where I tried to distill what I think is the clearest science about how to address burnout. And basically, I think the effective model is demand control support. So the finding is there are 3 ways to fight burnout. One is to reduce demands, to literally lighten the load that students are facing, and find out what the most stressful, projects and assignments and experiences are, and try to eliminate some of them or minimize them. A second is to increase control, which is to say, look, we can't always erase demands entirely, but we can give you more freedom, more choices about how you handle them, which makes you feel like you're in charge of them, as opposed to they're wreaking havoc on you. And then the third is support, right? To let people know that you do have their back, to normalize struggle, to make it okay to say you're not okay. And I don't know, I can talk about a couple of things that I've found interesting in my backyard at Wharton. One thing that I heard from my students, I think the first step is to try to figure out what are those big demands? What are the reasons that you feel like you lack control? Where is support missing? And one of the things I heard right away from my students was they face a lot of pressure to achieve. That a lot is riding on their grades. They're worried that they're not going to succeed in every class. And they were freaking out about my final exam, which is known to be extremely difficult, not because I want to stress our students out, but because I believe that what I teach matters and I want them to be motivated to master the material. So I let them know up front that the exam was going to be hard. What I didn't realize was that previous classes hadn't warned everyone that I only curve upward, not downward. So if the whole class bombs, then I'm going to raise everybody's grade. And that reassured them a little bit. But then they told me they were still stressed about not knowing everything they were supposed to know and underperforming relative to their peers. So I ended up running a little experiment. And I said, okay, hardest part of this exam is the multiple choice section. 150-point exam. I'll let you, on the 1 2-point multiple choice question that you're most unsure of, you can write down the name of a classmate who you think knows it. And if they get the answer right, you get the points too. Completely changed what happened next. Before, I had students studying individually. As soon as I announced that, they realized, well, we need to know who knows what, so we know who to write down. And they ended up creating a listserv. The entire class studied together. Each student volunteered to have expertise in a particular area. And as a result, the students ended up scoring 3% higher on the exam than they had the previous year. And it wasn't just because that was actually after accounting for the extra points they got for writing each other's names down. And it turned out the clearest evidence that I could gather was that the reason their grades improved was because they actually learned better when they taught the material. So if I was an expert on a whole domain, I was the one responsible for writing the summary and also explaining this stuff to the rest of my peers. And then, not only did my peers learn more, but I crystallized that knowledge. That to me was such a simple example of actually doing all 3 of these things, right? So all I thought I was doing was just easing their anxiety a little bit by saying, hey, write down a name on this 2-point out of 150 points exam. But the demands went down because they felt like they didn't have to know everything and they had a parachute on one question. Control went up. They felt like they had some choices about what information they wanted to know better than anybody else in the class and what they just had to be a little bit less familiar with. And support skyrocketed, right? All of a sudden, they had a whole group of peers who were not competing with them, but were actually collaborating with them to make everyone as knowledgeable as possible. Completely non-intuitive intervention when it comes to burnout, right? But it started with me asking, what is burning you out? And I think that's where you have to start at Queen's or anywhere else.
Great. Thanks, Adam.
Great. Another question from the audience would be, what is the meaning of giving in a world of competitive venture capitalists? And how can we form a group of givers in venture capital?
Well, my role model in the venture capital world for generosity is David Hornick. I wrote about him in the opening chapter of Give and Take. And David did things that people thought were insane for a venture capitalist. He would actually, when he would give a term sheet to entrepreneurs, he would tell them, look, if you want to go talk to other venture capitalists, take your time. I'm not going to pressure you with the deadline. He would host conferences where he invites the most promising entrepreneurs. He ended up early on, before anyone had heard of Twitter, inviting Jack Dorsey. He brought Tony Hsieh before Zappos was big. He brought these blue chip entrepreneurs, and he invited other venture capitalists to his conference to potentially scoop his deals. What is he thinking? Well, David has been extraordinarily successful. And one of the reasons he's been successful is he has a reputation for putting entrepreneurs' interests first. And I think he's demonstrated that over the years by encouraging people to take a better deal or encouraging someone to meet with other venture capitalists. And when I talked to him about it the first time, he said, look, I wouldn't do this if it were going to sacrifice my success. I'm not being selfless, right? What I'm doing is I'm trying to help people with no strings attached. I don't want anything back from each of them, but I believe in the long run that if I invest in being generous, that I will attract people into my network who share those values. And I think that's a pretty exciting way to live in the world. My favorite way to try to bring that into a VC community is through an exercise that I was originally introduced to when I was in grad school by Wayne Baker and Cheryl Baker, sociologist and entrepreneur. They created what they called the reciprocity ring. It was an exercise where you gathered people together in a group. You asked everyone to make a request for something they want or need, but can't get on their own. And then you challenge everybody else to try to use their knowledge and their networks to fulfill the request. And that was the whole activity. Everybody asks and everybody gives. And you see that all these people are able to receive help that they didn't expect, because in standard everyday interaction, if I need help, I go to my strongest ties, the people I know well and trust. Whereas in the reciprocity ring, you could go to anybody in that network and increase your odds of, finding the most connected person or the most knowledgeable person. And it allowed people to get help from somebody that they couldn't help in return. And in the last couple of years, Wayne and his team brought me in to help co-found this app called Give a Toss, which is basically an online version of the exercise. So in Give a Toss, the goal is to make it easy for people to seek and give help in 5 minutes a day. The goal is to do 5-minute favors. All you do is you join a community on Give a Toss. So you could create a venture capitalist community. You invite everyone to type their request, and then you can see the requests daily, and you decide which ones you think you might know something or someone that would be helpful. I've seen, when we've run this in my classes, I've seen about 80% of the requests get meaningful help. They're often from people who don't know each other previously or didn't have much of a relationship before. And what Wayne has found in his research with Nat Bulkley, which I think is amazing, is initially the norm of generosity spreads because people are worried about reputations. So I help because if I don't offer to help anybody in that exercise, everyone's going to know I'm a taker and I don't want to get outed. So, I make sure I have some visible contributions. But over time, the reputational concerns fade to the background. And the reason people keep helping is because of gratitude. That even if you leaned in the selfish direction, when somebody who's a complete stranger offers to help you get a job or to open a door to an industry you have no access to, you appreciate that. You're like, how can I pay you back? You're like, I don't know. I didn't want anything from you. And you become motivated to pay it forward. And I think that's the kind of norm I would like to see more groups and communities adopt. Not just VCs, all of us.
Absolutely, yes. We have another question from the room.
Okay, sorry, I can't see myself. Okay, hi. Hi, Adam. Thank you so much for being here and have followed your work for a while, and I can't believe I get to ask you a question. But I am curious how you navigated producing knowledge in an academic context and then kind of navigating over to a public context and why you did that, and if knowledge is more valuable in certain places from your perspective. And then kind of secondly, specifically in the context of work, how you talk to the more institutional forces that shape how work is organized and the norms that kind of dictate workplaces that might actually be above even a board type level, but really do shape the way that work plays out.
Oh, such rich questions. I think I need more context on both of them. So who are you? And tell me why you asked the first question for starters.
My name is Grace Mueller, and I'm doing a PhD in human geography, and I'm in my first year, so I know very little. But I'm interested in studying work in the context of the global South. So a little bit different, of course, than your work. But yeah, I potentially might go into academia, but in studying work and how work is shaped, sometimes I think academia may not be the right place for that knowledge to be produced and shared. But of course, it's very meaningful. And then the second question is, when you think about how work might actually change, then it kind of comes to the norms that capitalism has kind of shaped in our world, and that really does influence how work plays out. So I'm just wondering how to make it all better. And I think you've done so much wonderful work in that vein. So thank you for.
Thank you, Grace. I'm honored that my work piqued your interest. And on the first question, I love Donald Stokes's book, Pasteur's Quadrant, where he argued that there's this spectrum that people always talk about. On one end, you have basic science. On the other end, you have applied science. And people are constantly fighting in academia to basically the basic scientists are often considered superior. But then there's pressure from the outside world to go in the more applied direction. And the argument from Stokes was that like everything else in life, it's not one continuum, it's actually a 2x2. Those are separate axes. That the basic axis is what are your fundamental contributions to knowledge? And the applied axis is what are your contributions to the world? And he took Louis Pasteur as an example of a scientist who lived in the high cell, where he played a major role in developing germ theory, which is sort of relevant in a COVID world. But he also figured out how to pasteurize milk. And what Stokes was calling for was for more of us, especially in the social sciences, right? Whether you're a psychologist like me or a human geographer like you, for more of us to try to live in that quadrant, to say we can ask fundamental questions and still generate knowledge that's useful. Otherwise, why are we social scientists? If we're going to study human behavior, we ought to have something helpful to say to the humans that we study, right? And I found that really, really powerful. It left me thinking, okay, there's a time and a place to start crossing the bridge from pure ivory tower work to more Main Street kind of conversations. And for me, that was mostly post-tenure. Once I decided that I love teaching and I was fascinated by getting to do my own research, it was pretty clear that it would not be looked upon kindly if I tried to do some more publicly accessible work before tenure. And also it could really detract from my focus on learning how to publish my research and putting meaningful data out into the world. And so I got drawn into this field because I'd read some books like Influenced by Bob Cialdini, Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I'd read Malcolm Gladwell's first book, The Tipping Point, as an undergrad. And I love the idea of telling people the stories behind the data and bringing the studies to life with surprising anecdotes. And I thought I wanted to do it. And I kind of forgot about it while I was in grad school and while I was junior faculty because I was so focused on teaching and research. And then once I got tenure, it's like, why am I writing articles that maybe my mom will read because she's proud of me? Maybe, but she's probably going to get bored. And my students were really also asking me, why is your knowledge only accessible to people who take your class or read your journal articles? And that all of a sudden woke me up and reminded me, I've always wanted to do this, and maybe now is the time. I don't think there's a right path. I will say, though, that this has been a false dichotomy in bigger ways than I realized, because my favorite research projects that I've worked on, and I think the most important projects I've done in the last decade, have come out of popularizing my work. They have come from the questions that people ask when my research bumps into the real world. And I have, a CEO or a military general or a startup founder or a student, for that matter, who wasn't even in my class, ask me a question or make an observation. And I think that sharing your knowledge is one of the best ways to discover new insights and new questions to explore. So I think we should encourage people to live in that quadrant a lot earlier than I chose to. But I'm not sure it's a good career strategy, if that makes any sense. As far as the big institutions are concerned, I don't know. Honestly, I think this is beyond my expertise. I think especially as an organizational psychologist, where I was trained, and I think where I naturally think most effectively is really at the level of individuals and groups. And so when I confront problems like, well, work is far too central in Western societies. And I say this as somebody who studies work for a living. I still think there's more to life than work. What do I do about that? I don't know. I try to push more companies to run, 4-day work week experiments and to test 6-hour work days. I encourage people to read James Sussman's book, Work, about how for 95% of human history, people who were hunter-gatherers only worked roughly 15-hour weeks, and they led lives of leisure, right? And I think getting those ideas out there is really helpful. But in terms of actually reforming the institutions and the systems, it's just not my expertise. And so I would turn to political scientists, sociologists, economists, geographers, right? There are lots of areas of specialty that I think are equipped to do this kind of work. And it's just, I think it's beyond my knowledge. So I hope you'll take it on. I think it needs a lot of help.
Thank you so much.
Professor Grant, we truly appreciate your time. We couldn't get through all of the questions. There was so much interest. And thank you so much for the very insightful answers. I will be handing over to Anna. And thank you again so much.
Very nice. Thank you very, very much. Adam, in closing, I have to thank you for something personal, because when I was actually reading some months ago, Think Again, you have this concept that provided really a lot of clarity for me personally. You have this concept of task conflict versus relationship conflict. And Mohammed always says to me, I'm very conflict averse. But that really provided a lot of clarity, because it's something so tangible that one could think about. Because, task conflict being, what movie do you want to see? Or do you have a difference in opinion? It's about these factual things versus having conflict within the core of your relationship. And I just want to say that was really helpful to me. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm so glad. I can't take credit. Eddie Jen's research is what put it on the map. And it was eye-opening for me too, to realize, wait, like all these times when I think I'm in a fun debate and other people's feelings are getting hurt, I thought we were having a task conflict and they were experiencing it as a relationship conflict. And also all the times I've avoided conflict because I thought it was going to hurt the relationship, maybe there was a way to just say, you know what, it's okay to disagree about decisions, about strategies, even about where we're going to go for dinner, right? And we can do that without making it personal and emotional. Or even if we have emotions about it, to say, well, that means we really care. And that's not always a bad thing. So I also found that eye-opening.
Well, thank you. And it provides for better outcomes. So I appreciate it very much. Adam, thank you. Professor at large, author of multiple bestsellers, including Think Again, Knowing What You Don't Know. Thank you for your generosity in being here with us and in sharing your life-changing, valuable insights with us all. Ladies and gentlemen, Think Again is a masterpiece. I encourage you all to pick up a copy. Thank you to everyone in the UK and around the world for attending this truly wonderful hour with the inimitable Professor Adam Robb. Good night all. Thank you.
Thank you.